Hey,
Hi, I'm Joaquin. Joaquin Pedro Valdes is like my whole name, but you can just call me Joaquin or JP for those who can't pronounce it. I'm pure Filipino. I am an immigrant from the Philippines. I'm currently in the UK in London. Recently, not too long ago, I facilitated uh, an accent workshop, what I call an accent workshop. Um, but mainly, it's really a contextual study trying to understand the history of the Filipino accent or whatever that means, right? We all have an idea of what the Filipino accent is or how a Filipino speaks English because we see it with Joe Coy or how it's represented on as a punchline on TV shows or by comedians or whatnot. Or if not a punchline, you have a lot of very famous and notable Filipinos like Manny Pacquiao or Lea Salonga, who I would argue both have Filipino accents. They sound very different, but then they're both equally Filipino accents. So I wanted to study what is it that makes a Filipino accent and what defines it and where does it come from. And my interest in this only came about because as an actor in the UK, we're at least we're encouraged to study different accents of the UK. So we're meant to study. I mean, Sean would know this, but then my agent said, "Oh, you should have a northern accent in your pocket. You should know exactly what the rules are for a Scottish accent or a Welsh accent or whatnot." And in my studying different UK and English accents, I realized that I had a sound. I didn't think I had a sound, but I did have my own sound. And then I went into studying the Filipino accent, and a lot of it is this is going to be a mouthful, so I hope that's all right.
go
But
ahead.
a lot of a lot of our accent, or how when I say a Filipino accent, I mean when a Filipino speaks English, right? A lot of it is really a result of five major factors, which I have broke down. These are all theoretical, and I'm currently still studying. Well, the first one is history, of course. The next one is geography. Next one is status. Next one is generation. And the last one is the diaspora or the migration. So all of these five factors really affect how a Filipino sounds or how a Filipino would understand and assimilate the English language. To answer your first question, Francesca, we're coming from an archipelago of around 7,000 islands. And with these 7,000 islands come a plethora of different languages, at least 120 living languages right now, 120 to 187 different languages in the Philippines. But the four main ones are Ilocano, Tagalog, Cebuano, and Hiligaynon. These are the most spoken ones with around 4 to 8 million speakers at any given time. Four different languages, they sound very different. So that affects essentially how we understand sounds and we formulate sounds and words. The whole history of how we landed with Tagalog as the national language, and I keep using air quotes here, it's quite telling. It's quite problematic. And the reason why they defaulted to it was because they needed something to place hold on what the national language was, while Congress and the government kind of figured out what they wanted to establish as a national language. They knew what it was called. They wanted to call it Filipino, which eventually became Filipino when they started introducing softer consonants into the alphabet. They knew what the national language was to be called, which was Filipino. But what comprised the Filipino language, it was still up for debate. Until now, it's still up for debate. It's generally based on Tagalog, right? But then still a lot of like the Cebuanos and the Ilocano speakers and the Hiligaynon speakers and all the other speakers say, why is it Tagalog? Why is it Tagalog centric? And then it goes into my next problem, which is this whole idea of geography and how everything is so compact in Manila.
Mhm.
For a 7,000 island archipelago, everything is jam packed into the center or this notion of a center, which is Manila. And that goes into my next theory about status, about how the Filipino accent or Filipinos' grasp of English is now determined by whoever in the center says, this is how it should sound. Then you have Manila-centric or people who of higher status make a mockery of people who don't speak English in the way the Manileños speak English. Accents or our Filipino accent or our sound should not be an object of punchlines, or should not just be an item of othering, because all of it is valid. Because the accent and the way we speak English is not just because of our colonial history, but it's also about our future. It's also about generations that went to the different countries in the world and started to propagate there. Filipinos who went to the States and the United Kingdom and Europe and Japan and Iraq and the Middle East, and they built lives there. I mean, that's the story of the Filipino. And whatever sound they have when they speak English is reflective of that journey. I just finished a little video. Actually, Aimée has seen this video. I did a little video for the NHS nurses, the Filipinos and the NHS nurses, and I worked with a small theater company called New Earth Theater, and we gathered some Filipino heritage actors. I think I'm the only immigrant, and everybody else was first generation who grew up in the UK. And I basically translated Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, which is one of the most, shall I compare you to the Summer's Day, the most famous love letter of Shakespeare. I translated into Filipino, or into my Filipino, which is Tagalog mainly. And then I had all these other actors speak it in their own different UK or English dialects, wherever they are from. And at the end, the last two lines, I asked everyone to speak the Tagalog one. And that came with a lot of resistance, because you have these Filipino British who didn't want to speak Tagalog, or who were very insecure about their own Tagalog. And it was basically a reverse of how a Filipino migrant would feel about their own English. And I love that exercise of them embracing the Filipino language, regardless of how they feel they grasp it. And it was a lot of broken Tagalog, which was perfectly fine and actually added more beauty to the whole piece, because that was essentially their way to say thank you for everything, for learning our culture, for living here, for taking care of us, and being far away from the comfort of your own home. And it's uncomfortable for us to learn these last two Tagalog lines, but it's nothing compared to the discomfort that you're sacrificing for us. So I guess that was the whole message of that little poem. First thing that comes to mind is, it's not so much how we're misperceived or misrepresented, because I'll tell you, as a Filipino, Filipinos in the Philippines are just happy every time they see a Filipino on the world stage or world screen, or a Filipino is mentioned, they're going to claim ownership to, oh, there's a singer in The Voice or an American Idol, she's 1/18th Filipino, oh, she's Filipino. We're just happy every time there's a Filipino that's mentioned or talked about, even if it's not in the best light. I would say that the only downside of that is that there's just such a limited, it's not misrepresentation, but just a limited representation. It's very small right now. In terms of language, how it's limited is we almost only see it as a joke. People only use the accent as a punchline, as a part of a sketch. And I'm not knocking on that. Those stereotypes exist for a reason. right? I mean, because there is some truth to it. That's what stereotypes are. There is some truth. What I'm saying is that that's not just what the Filipino sound is about. And there are ways to represent the Filipino sound that is more dimensional, that is more complex, that is deeper and serious as well. And I think my hope for the future is that we see more work, whether it be in things that we consume, whether it be in streaming devices, in music, in plays, in films, on TV, and at a high standard, at an amazing global standard. My hope is that this Filipino sound is better represented, is more represented in this scale. And we're starting to see it. I'm not usually a mystic, but then for some reason, like I just feel in my gut that we're now at an era in the world, in the narrative, wherein our voices are a little bit more heard,
Right.
and our stories are a little bit more sought after. Um, and I was just talking to some of my friends here, like, how can there not be a film or a TV series or heck, just a song about Filipino nurses?
Right.
And Filipino nurses have been on the front line for any major event where healthcare and nurturing and care is needed. There are Filipino nurses in 911 and 9/11. There are Filipino nurses in the London bombing. There are Filipino nurses everywhere during this COVID pandemic. And it's our history of exporting nurses and being known to be the best nurses there are in the world go back to the 1930s. So it's interesting. It's why are we not putting these stories on screen? you know
Right.
and I think that those are the questions I like asking, because I like watching sitcoms a lot, and there's a lot of reference to Filipinos, especially if it's a joke, like, oh yeah, he's dating a Filipino, whatever. But then we don't see these people,
Right.
and I think now we're coming into a time where people want to see and hear these Filipinos and not just talk about them. And I guess my goal in my little goal and my little dream is to, if I can just bring about how much I love the different sounds of the Filipino accent into something that unifies it, and that unifies us as a people. I like doing this thing like in the end of the workshop, wherein I ask some of the participants to speak a Shakespeare speech, whether it's a sonnet or whether it's Juliet or Edmund from King Lear or whatever they know, Hamlet, and to speak it in the Filipino accent.
That's amazing.
And I tell you, like, one of the participants, it got very emotional because he has a speech from King Lear, and the character is Edmund, and there's a beautiful speech of Edmund about legitimacy, about being called legitimate, because he's a bastard child in the story, and he's been learning this speech, and he did it at the end of the workshop in the Filipino accent. And after I asked him, how do you feel? And he says, I've successfully othered my dad for sounding like this all my life.
Mhm.
And after reading this speech in this way, sounding like him, it feels like I've redeemed him. And I've asked for his own, it's almost like he asked for his own forgiveness. And it was really, really emotional. And it was beautiful. Like the Filipino accent can be serious and can be taken seriously.